So today's question was from Jay Daniel, and this was his question. What are your opinions on usury? The Old Testament and the Torah, etc., make it forbidden to charge usury to other Jews. Today we're under major usury. Are you okay with living under these usury systems? Usury is a really interesting subject. Jay Daniel's already given us some insights. What I want to do to start off the session is basically start with, I broke it down into kind of 5 things. I want to first talk about what usury actually is, right? Just so those of us who are not familiar with that kind of language know exactly what that is. I want to basically give God's view on it. Ultimately, we'll look at some scriptural examples. I basically want to highlight as well some key figures in the Bible, how they basically reference usury, etc. Then I want to talk about more specifically what Jay Daniel was asking me specifically about right now. Are we under a major usury in the world today? And ultimately, I want to wrap up this question with just some final thoughts that I think will be very beneficial. So again, if you have a question on anything Bible related that you are interested in finding out an answer to, feel free to put it in the chat section. Hopefully by God's grace, I'll be able to answer the question for you. First things first, what is usury? Well, just to kind of simplify this for a lot of just the more modern audience, right, who are not familiar with that kind of term, we can liken it. There's kind of 2 definitions when you really think about this. We would liken it today as sort of like an interest, right? If you think about the thumbnail of the video, it's about interest. So you basically make a payment or you borrow money, right? And there's an interest payment to basically pay back. So when you think about this question, that is basically like the broad, like the basic meaning, right? You charge interest on a payment on a borrowed good, etc. Another one, which we will see in a moment when we start to go through the scriptures, which you can kind of take from this kind of definition as well, is not just necessarily taking interest, but more so like this excessive amount of interest where you're basically turning it into like high rate extortion ultimately. So those are the 2 kind of definitions. So first things first, in regards to answering Jay Daniel's question, I want to go to some scriptural examples. So not only do I give you like a basic understanding, I'll give you obviously scriptural examples to kind of whet your appetite. The first one I want to go to, and I remember I said I want to give you God's view on this, right, with scriptural examples. So I want to first take you to the book of Exodus. And what does it say? It says, if thou lend money to my people, poor by thee, what should you do? Thou shalt not be to him as an usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. Right? So very simple, very concise. God is basically saying here, look, don't borrow to your brothers under the guise of taking back some sort of interest payment. So let's take a look at this one right here. So this is now Leviticus. And again, this is God's laws being passed on to the people. And he says, and if thy brother, that's a key word as well, be waxen poor. So it's basically just a cross-reference to what we just kind of covered, but it gives an additional bit of insight here because it talks about if they're poor, then thou shalt do what? Relieve him, right? A stranger or a sojourner that he may live with thee. Then he says, take thou no usury of him or increased, but fear thy God that thy brother may live with thee. So the concept here God is basically giving the people at this point is, if you are going to lend to one of like a fellow Israelite who's ultimately fallen into poverty, don't basically now try and borrow them money or goods or whatever it is, any sort of service, with the intention to now try and receive back from them, and especially not in an extortionate way. And even one more thing I'll show you, right? We can even read this from this piece of text as well, which I think is actually quite interesting. This is the next line. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase, right? So I know I've already talked about both scenarios. I've talked about how you can lend money, but you can also lend goods. Exodus and Leviticus up until this point, 2 books, the second and third book in the Bible, right, have basically given us example. The thing that's actually key is what you find just from a plain reading in the Bible is this particular stipulation was only for fellow Israelites, right? So this wasn't necessarily something that you would do for other nations. I'll talk about at least one reason why that actually may happen and why that actually may be a good thing. Let's go to Deuteronomy. And this is, again, the third example. So we've gone from Exodus to Leviticus and then Deuteronomy. So we've skipped the book of Numbers. Now we're in the final book of the Torah in regards to the books of Moses. Now he says, thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, same as before, usury of money, usury of victual, same as Leviticus, and this goes even further now, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. So look, any scenario where you have this sort of interest payment, this is forbidden. Don't do this to your fellow Israelites. Then he says, unto a stranger, so someone who's not an Israelite, thou mayest lend upon usury. So you can lend out of interest to someone else, but not to your fellow citizen Israelite. But unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. Going into the new land, and God is basically instilling in them 3 times at least, when your brother is poor, when a fellow Israelite is poor, basically take care of them, right? Look after them and don't try and basically get any interest off them. Don't try and profit from them. But in this final example, he qualifies it and says, or makes it even more direct here, and he says, look, you can exact interest from a stranger, but not from a fellow Israelite. One thing I'll say in regards to the scenario, why would it be for the Israelite, not for the stranger? One thing I would say, just thinking about this, just from I feel like from a basic standpoint, is if you were a stranger, you potentially were not obviously following, right, the Israelite way, right? And really and truly, that could be a loophole in a way in which a stranger can now come and basically borrow money, borrow something from an Israelite as a way to basically gain ground and ultimately try and take over the country. So that is at least one reason why it would make sense for God to basically put this stipulation as to not doing this to other nations who necessarily don't follow the laws of the Israelite, etc. We also know that obviously if a stranger was obviously coming into Israel and ultimately was taken on the customs, things most likely would be different, right? So this is 3 examples from the Bible, kind of just outlaying God's perspective on usury. Now I want to give you a couple of examples of people in the scripture and how they basically classify it. Because yes, we can see from what God is saying, his kind of view, but now let's actually see this in action. So the first example I want to give you is from the book of Jeremiah, one of the most famous prophets in the whole of the Bible, obviously especially in the Old Testament. And what does he say? He said something really interesting, and all of these examples I'm going to give you 3 examples, and all of them are interesting in their own right, and I definitely recommend, as always, as is my custom, right, go and search these things out, read these things in more context at some point. So after God has basically said, look, judgment is coming, this is what Jeremiah says. He says, woe is me, he's in trouble ultimately. Why? My mother, that thou hast borne me a man of strife and a man of contention to the whole earth. Jeremiah went around preaching a hard message for the Israelites. And what does he say? So he's basically saying, look, he's like this troublesome guy because he's going around, he uses the terminology, the whole earth, but really he's just talking about Israel, right? And what does he say? I have neither lent on usury, so I haven't done this, nor men have lent to me on usury. Every one of them doth curse me. So what's Jeremiah saying there? Jeremiah is basically saying, look, I'm the one that's delivering all of this bad news because of the wickedness that's around me. And because I'm delivering this bad news, I'm seen as this bad guy that's ultimately, and people are cursing me. But look at Jeremiah's defense. He said, he used the example, this is what I brought up. He used the example of basically taking and giving interest. I'm not even one of those guys who's basically giving out with interest or taking back. The reason I brought it up in regards to this particular context is because it's highlighting Jeremiah's view of giving with interest. By what he's saying is giving us insights as to the mindset of the people at the day. Giving upon usury or taking interest or taking interest or even giving interest to someone was seen as something very negative. Now we're looking at Ezekiel, another famous prophet in the Old Testament. Again, similar fashion to Jeremiah. This is sometime further in the future now in timeline wise perspective, and God is now saying to Ezekiel, the next man of God, look, talk to the Israelites and say this. So he's now starts talking. God says, look, I'm going to start judging people differently. And now he's talking about someone particularly, and he says, look, he hath not given forth upon usury. So he hasn't given with interest, neither has he taken any increase. So the person that is doing this, that basically listening to what God says, what does God say? He says, this kind of person has walked in his statutes, has kept his judgments to deal truly. He is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord God. He goes further. When you scroll down, he now changes it. The person who doesn't do these things, who's not obedient, who's not listening to what I am saying, what does he say? This person, and notice he mentions a couple of different things, but he gives this particular example that we're talking about in regards to interest, right? He says, hath given forth upon usury, so he's given with interest in return in his mind, and hath taken increase. Then what does God say? Shall he then live? So the person that's doing all of these different abominations, this particular example as well, what does God say? This person should not live. He have done all these, and God calls these abominations. So we can see this is very significant. One more example here as well, right? This is another example. The person who has taken off his hand from the poor and has not received usury, okay, this is the third example here, he shall not die for the iniquity of his father. Again, read all this stuff in your own time in more context, but you can see so far from God's judgments in the law that was given to Moses, and then based on some of the most devout men of God that we've looked at so far, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. I'll give you one more example in Ezekiel as well. We're seeing God's perspective. So here he says, in thee have they taken gifts to shed blood. He's now pronouncing judgment, more judgment on Israel. And he says, in thee have they taken gifts to shed blood. Thou hast taken usury and increase. So you're doing this stuff. And thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by extortion. If you remember back to the two definitions that I gave you, the second definition was one of what? Of a sort of extortion. And it's scriptures like this that will basically lend people to this kind of deeper definition of what this whole interest taking, interest giving scenario actually is. And what does he say? The person that's doing this has forgotten him, right? And then ultimately God again is just going to go into a lot of judgment. This is another practical example, not like Ezekiel where God is speaking, or Jeremiah where Jeremiah is speaking about this activity. This is a real life scenario activity in the Bible when this was actually happening. And Nehemiah is a powerful book. He's a very stern and tough guy, and in this particular scenario, I'm not going to, like I said, spend too much time on it. Read this in your own time. It's a really great read, right? He's basically talking about these people, the Israelites, that were basically taking part in this interest with fellow Israelites. And he basically, just to kind of give you a little bit of flavor, right? So he's petitioning them, restore, give back, basically, I pray you, to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, and their houses, and also money and corn and wine and the oil that you exact of them. So basically drop the tax. All these taxes you've basically put on them, drop them, don't continue to do them, right? And what did they say? They said they will restore. We are basically going to give this up. So those are definitions of what usury actually is, or interest, if you want to say it, based on just modern vernacular. We've given you examples about what God basically says in regards to the commandment of taking or giving. We've looked at a couple of examples, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Nehemiah. Again, go through them in your own time to get deeper context. Now, to add more context to the question of what J. Daniel was asking, what do I think personally, right? And this is what I'm going to say first and foremost. So J. Daniel kind of mentioned, and this kind of gets to just modern day, we're Christians, right? Obviously, all of this stuff was under the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, basically for Israel and anyone who basically adopted Israel's practices. But what about us as Christians today, living in the 21st century currently, and looking at what it says in the Bible, looking at God's view on these kind of things in the Bible, and now being ultimately a Christian, modern day Christian today, right? So do I believe we're under major usury, and what do I think about it? My view on this particular topic, first and foremost, is I feel and I believe, I wouldn't necessarily agree with everything that Jay Daniels says or presented. One thing I will say is we have a choice, right? For the majority of us, especially living in the Western world, we have a choice whether we decide to engage in being under, because he referenced heavy levies, basically heavy interest. In many cases, we have an opportunity to decide and say, you know what, I'm not going to subject myself into those scenarios. But there are other times when you may be things may be so bleak, you may be so destitute that you just say, you know what, I need to kind of sell myself in whatever way it is in regards to basically like paying the debt. And I don't mean that in like a derogatory term or anything like that. I'm just talking about, you may now need to, let's say for example, take out a loan, credit cards, etc., 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 right? So I don't think we're in a position, even where there's high leverage stuff going on, where we do not have a choice. I believe we do have a choice in many ways. And someone, as I thought about, when I thought about this, is a good example, who's very popular today, is a guy like Dave Ramsey. Most people know who Dave Ramsey is, especially if you've been interested in any sort of finance. Why do I bring him up? Because a couple of reasons. He's heavy on what would be referenced in scripture time as no usury, right? Don't go into any sort of debt. Don't be in needing to pay interest to anyone else. Now, the second reason I bring him up is not just because he's very against the debt, against usury, right? The second reason I brought him up is because he's a professing Christian, right? He's a professing evangelical Christian today, and he holds these principles. So because of that, right, Randall asks who is he? Dave Ramsey is a very popular, a financial expert. I'll just put it like that. Very popular American, and he's a professing Christian. People like Dave Ramsey are prime examples, whether you're young or old, of how even in like major oppression, if you want to call it that, even in a scenario where you can be enticed into going into major like debt, etc., he's someone who's basically waving the flag, right, and saying, look, don't go into debt, get out of debt as quickly as possible, etc., and do something completely different. Even in a scenario where we may be in major interest, major usury, high debt, all these different kind of things, scenarios, we still have a choice in many cases. This is for those who are truly struggling, right? I know a lot of what I said is really general, right, in regards to you have choices, all these different kind of things, but there are situations, single mums, for example, who are working round the clock for whatever reason. They don't have a husband in the house to basically carry the load with them or lessen some of the load. A scenario like that, which is not ideal, right? Clearly not by God's standards. That's not an ideal scenario. For people in those kind of scenarios, working around the clock, and it doesn't have to just be women either, right? Men can be like very destitute as well. So this, I don't think is going to be the majority. This will be more so, if it's not the majority, more so be a minority, right, of people who may be using all of the financial principles that maybe someone like Dave Ramsey or someone else may say, looking at biblical principles to basically get out of debt and poverty, all those kind of things, and is still very like struggling heavily. In a scenario like that, what I would personally advise, if you're struggling in that kind of scenario, like really, really struggling, like this isn't just you're not applying yourself or anything along those lines, I would say go and find Bible believing churches, right? A Bible believing congregation, assembly of Christians, and basically seek help. And by God's grace, those kind of people who are trying to live biblically will do very similar to what we kind of looked at in regards to the Old Testament scriptures, and help you till you can get to a position where you can like be stable enough to basically manage on your own. We see examples in the early church. This is now New Testament period. Read this in your own time as well. This is an example of where believers were banding together. They had all things common. When you find people like this that are really like after God's own heart, as New Testament believers, interested like seriously in the scripture, people band together and things get better. And this is the key part right here as well. Neither was there any among them that lacked. I think a scripture like this in conjunction with what we've talked about in regards to usury is very significant, because it highlights Old Testament kind of principles. God didn't want his people basically trying to take advantage in any way. Like progressing off the back of your brother or your sister. And as Christians, we have the same mandate, maybe just in a different scenario, where it's like, look, you see someone struggling, and as from a Christian perspective, it's almost like the onus is even on us even more to branch out and help those in need, right? So if you see someone in need, obviously being Christ-like would be to help them. Some people say, you know what, I mentioned Dave Ramsey before, right? Some people just strictly stay away from all types of interest. Even if they lend money to people or lend things to people, they may lend it to them not with the intention to, you know what, you need to give it back to me plus interest. That's one thing. But also, secondly, if you're already in these scenarios, let's say, for example, you're in heavy debt, I wouldn't advise you to try and go deeper into debt. I'd be trying to advise you to come out of it quicker. One of the big reasons this happens heavily is because a lot of us look at what other people have. We're looking at loads of advertisements. We're looking at all of these different things. This is one of the reasons, a key sign of the end times, right? I did a video a couple of days ago. I'll leave that in the description box as well, talking about this. We've gone through multiple different phases in the last 10 to 20 years, which have got us into a position where we're so focused on other people and what other people have. Those are some of the factors which make us think, you know what, I need a new car or I need a new house, when you really don't. Think about it from that perspective. The next time you're seeing advertisements for certain things, you have to think to yourself, look, like, this isn't necessarily essential. Let me give you an example, right? This is a device, right? This isn't about this. Obviously, I'm gonna say this, like, this isn't sponsored, just for the record, right? I feel like I have to say that. This is a device. We don't even need to say what brand it is, but most people know what this is, right? This device, this brand came out with a new device recent days, right? They're on number 12, whatever. This is number 6, right? So I'm 6 generations behind. And you know what? I don't care. Why? Because at the end of the day, what is this device supposed to do? Pick up and give calls, and smartphones, as they say, pretty much do exactly the same with this phone opposed to a phone that's just coming out now. Yes, there's little things, or some people say big things, but nothing to the essential nature of the device, right? The original nature of the device was to receive and give and to output calls. It can do that. It can do other things, etc. So many people will say, look, I'm going deeper and deeper and deeper into this subjection, not even the company per se, but to your provider, right? And hopefully that's an example of how some people will say, look, I'm not falling into that trap or going deeper into the trap. I'm going to make decisions on my own finances, and I could buy a better phone or a more later phone, but is it essential? The way I kind of go, just to give you more context, is I like to buy when I feel there's been a huge shift.